Okay, welcome everyone to the beginning of a new series on the Megillas. I was told that the Jewish Center wanted to add more Tanakh study to their program. And I know the previous assistant rabbi, Rabbi Buchler, used to give some Tanakh shiurim. And I was given the privilege of creating and putting together a new series on Tanakh. And I was told that however I wanted to run it, whatever I wanted to do, they'd hear my ideas. And the first idea that I pitched, and what we're hopefully going to start tonight, is a study of the 5 Megillot. The thinking is that we're at a time of the year where we're very soon going to be coming on the holidays, where the 5 Megillas are going to be read. And my idea was to learn through the Megillas in that order, in the same order that we'll encounter them when we reach those Chagim. Because it seems to me that if Megillah was chosen to be read on a certain holiday and a certain Chag, there's something about the character of that Megillah that tells us important things about the holiday itself. And sometimes the connection is obvious. For example, we read Eicha on Tisha B'Av, Eicha, which talks about the destruction of Yerushalayim. So clearly, it makes a lot of sense that we would read it on Tisha B'Av. But oftentimes the connection is not so obvious. So why do we read Rus on Shavuos? Why do we read Shir Shirim on Pesach? Why do we read Koheles on Sukkot? 3 out of 5, the connection doesn't really seem so apparent. And as part of this ongoing series, I hope to explore that question a little bit more deeply, especially for the less obvious Megillas. Now, the most obvious connection, I'd have to say, between any Megillah and a holiday would have to be Esther and Purim. And Purim is only just over a month away. And Purim is the only biblical holiday that's not mentioned in the Torah. And it's a very strange holiday. It's a strange holiday in how we practice it. It's a strange holiday in the minhagim, in the halachos, why we dress up on Purim, why there are halachos to get drunk until one doesn't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman, whereas during the rest of the year, wine and alcohol and being drunk is generally frowned upon. Purim is a very strange holiday. And Esther is also a very strange book, which hopefully we'll make clear tonight. And I intend this year to have 3 parts, after which I'm going to open the floor for any questions or comments, and I hope people will have questions or comments. I don't intend to speak long, and I do hope these classes will be somewhat interactive. And if you type your questions into the chat, you may do that as well, and I'll read them as soon as I finish my remarks. And if you have any burning questions or something you want to say, which is very important, of immediate importance, please feel free to interrupt me at any time. So again, I don't intend to speak long, and I do hope that I will hear from you as much as you've come tonight to learn from me, and I'm very grateful that you've come to learn. I'm here also to learn from everyone else. So first part of this shiur, and tonight we're not going to get into Esther itself. I just want to give the framework of the book of Esther and some background, some things you might have heard, some things you might not have heard, and hopefully we'll find interesting. So before I begin anything else, besides for anything else one can say about the book of Esther, one has to agree that it's a phenomenal work of literature. It's really not very long. It's only 10 chapters, and some chapters are very short. And unlike most other books in Tanakh, it has certain elements that are lacking, I think, almost everywhere else. And what I'm talking about are elements of satire. It has irony, it has comedy, it has tragedy. There are complex symmetries in the book. There are reversals. There are elements of foreshadowing, recurring motifs. And it's a really very well-written book. And the story is quite gripping. And if you know, we've heard the story so many times. You know, man, I've heard the story hundreds of times probably. So it's a little bit hard to have that sense of drama and the sense of excitement when you read it again. But you have to imagine reading the book for the first time and not knowing what's going to happen and seeing everything reversed really around chapter 5 into the second half of the book. It's really a very gripping read. And a lot of those elements, especially the more comic and more exaggerated elements, are picked up in the Midrashim and really maximized in the Midrashim a lot. And I want to give a few Midrashic examples of this, of what I want to call this comic element of something being exaggerated far beyond what we might consider normal or usual. And so, for example, in the Megillah, Vashti was told by Achashverosh to appear wearing her crown. And the Medrash reads this pasuk And the pasuk doesn't tell us really anything more than that about the request. But the Medrash picks up on it and says that Vashti was ordered to appear wearing nothing but her crown. In other words, completely naked and only wearing her crown. Furthermore, when she refuses to come, there are no details given on why she refused to come in the Megillah itself. But the Midrashim point out that the reason she didn't want to come is because she developed these hideous boils and even grew a tail, which is a really, really, if you think about it, if you're hearing this for the first time, it's a really exaggerated and a bit of a comic picture of a very beautiful queen who doesn't want to come because she all of a sudden has grown a tail, especially if we follow the other midrashim which talk about what an evil and wicked person she was. Now, of course, those don't appear in the Megillah either. Shifting gears slightly to Haman and Mordechai, the Megillah just talks about Haman leading Mordechai around town on the king's horse and shouting in front of him that this is what the king requested be done to the man that the king wants to honor. But the midrashim add many details. The midrashim say that Haman's daughter, as they were passing under her roof, she emptied a chamber pot on the man leading the horse because she thought the man leading the horse was Mordechai. And then when the man leading the horse looked up, and when the man leading the horse looked up and she saw that it was her own father, she jumped off the roof and killed herself because she was so upset with what she had done. And when Haman arrived home that night, after having been completely embarrassed in front of the entire town, he wasn't given time to shower by the time the queen's guards came to take him to her second banquet. And finally, I want to give one more example, is that when Haman was angry against Mordechai, the Megillah itself, Megillah Esther, really just points out the fact that Mordechai didn't want to bow down to him. But the Midrashim create a whole narrative around this. And they say that earlier in the story, before the Megillah had started, Haman and Mordechai were two generals of the king. They led the king's armies into war, and Haman was not very careful with the food that the king, the supplies that they had been given, and Mordechai was more frugal, and Haman's supplies ran out, and eventually Mordechai took over Haman's soldiers and agreed to pay them on condition that Haman would become Mordechai's slave. And he didn't have any paper to sign the contract. So what they did was they wrote the contract that Haman would become Mordechai's slave on the sole of Mordechai's shoe. And according to these midrashim, when everyone was now bowing to Haman, who had been elected to the second in command right behind the king, Mordechai would stand up and show them the sole of his shoe, and ridiculing and embarrassing Haman in front of everyone else. And these are very exaggerated stories. These are very, kind of these comic and tragic elements are coming, these ironic elements of this slave that's now become the second in command of the king, with maybe have some parallel to Yosef and the Yosef story. But nevertheless, these elements, these really interesting literary elements are followed through in the Midrashim as well. Now, part number 2 of this year, I want to talk about the controversy of Megillah Esther, because it's a book that's so popular, especially among school children, and those of us fortunate enough to have a yeshiva education and have learned this story over and over again from a very young age. Really hard to appreciate how controversial the book of Esther really is. So Esther is in some ways similar to Shir HaShirim, which hopefully we'll talk about in a few weeks. It's a very radical book. And there are at least 3 major concerns with either with both Shir HaShirim and Esther, or with Esther alone. So neither Shir HaShirim nor Esther ever mention God explicitly, and they also don't talk about these central biblical and Jewish concepts like davening, like korbanos, like Torah, like nevuah, like mitzvos, and indeed, the closest place that Esther ever comes to mentioning God is in Esther 4:14, where Mordechai tells Esther that if you are silent now and you don't stand up when your people are in danger and your people are about to be killed, we will be saved mimakom acher, from another place. And many of the Mefarshim pick up on mimakom acher and say that's a reference to God, but it's really very striking that Mordechai doesn't say that if you don't save the people, God will save the people. Why not say it explicitly? Additionally, picking up on this problem, the Vilna Gaon tries to solve it by saying that every time the word Hamelech, the king, is used in Esther without reference to Achashverosh himself, or without being attached to Hamelech Achashverosh, It's meant to be understood as a reference to God, but why God wasn't mentioned explicitly is definitely seen as an issue. So that's the first problem. So additionally, within the same problem, in terms of prayer, there's no prayer mentioned in the book ever, which is very surprising because the Jews are in incredible peril. Esther does ask the Jews to fast on her behalf, but why she never tells Mordechai, please daven for me, have the people daven, there's no reference to that whatsoever. And it has to be in the oral tradition. It's not in the written tradition, is quite striking. And furthermore, not only are there no references to the mitzvos, to Torah, to Hashem, to davening, but there seem to be violations of the Torah in the book of Esther. Esther is married to a non-Jewish king. We're not told explicitly about what she ate, but we are told that she hid the fact that she was Jewish. And so was she eating non-kosher food? It could be easily argued that Esther is at least implying that Esther ate non-Jewish, non-kosher food. Nevertheless, the Midrashim come along and add many details which solve a lot of these problems. So for example, according to the Gemara and Megillah, many of these come from the Gemara and Megillah, Mordechai wasn't simply a simple Jew who was exiled with Yechanya HaMelech, as the Megillah says, but he was a member of the Anshe Knesset HaGedola, of the Jewish Supreme Court at the end of Bayis Sheni, at the end of Bayis Rishon and beginning of Bayis Sheni. Furthermore, not only was he a member of the Anshe Knesset HaGedola, but he and Esther were both prophets, and that's absent from the text entirely. We don't see either of those details anywhere in the book of Esther. Not only does Esther pray, according to the Midrashim, but at the moment before she approaches the king uninvited, she writes Tehillim chapter 42, and that's her prayer, which gets incorporated into another part of the Ksuvim into the Tehillim. And again, that's not mentioned. Not only is that Perek not brought down in the book of Esther, but not even a reference, a word, a pasuk, Esther davened before she went to the king. Nothing. Again, as I mentioned before, no reference was made explicitly to what she ate, but the Medrash tells us that she only ate kosher food, or that she went vegetarian, like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Whereas the vegetarianism of those four characters of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are mentioned explicitly in Sefer Daniel. Nowhere is it said explicitly in the book of Esther. The Gemara in several places talks about many intricate halachic solutions as to how Esther could have slept with a non-Jewish king, and many halachos are learned from those discussions. And just one more example in this vein, Mordechai finds great hope in the story from a conversation he has with young Jewish school children about the psukim they'd learned that day. So the Midrashim take very, seemingly very simple people, maybe some controversial people who may have explicitly or implicitly violated mitzvos in the Torah, and creates these giants out of them and turns them into these incredible people who really are very worth looking up to, and are wonderful prophets and tzaddikim in the Jewish tradition. So that's the first reason for the controversy of Esther, because it seems to be it's lacking some piety. It would seem it doesn't seem to fit in with the rest of the books of Tanakh. Another reason why it was controversial is because in different ways, both Shir Shirim and Esther celebrate different forms of female sexuality and female autonomy, which is lacking in other parts of Tanakh for sure. And finally, the third reason, the one that's brought down explicitly in the Gemara, is that there seems to be something problematic about the celebration in Esther, about the fact that the Jews were allowed to slaughter their enemies. There's a tradition brought down by Rav Shmuel, son of Yehuda, this is in Maseches Megillah, where Esther wrote to the Chachamim, and she said, I want you to include me in the works of Tanakh. And they said, if we do that, then you're going to make the rest of the nations angry with us. You're going to make them upset because we're celebrating the fact that we killed so many of our enemies. And Esther had to argue back and say, but you have to understand that the story that happened in the book of Esther is already recorded in the history books of the nations of the world. They already know the story. There's no reason why we shouldn't include it in our Tanakh as well. And there were similar reservations about including Shir Shirim in Tanakh, and it wasn't so clear that either Esther or Shir Shirim would have made it in at all. And we'll hopefully discuss some of those discussions about Shir Shirim when we talk about that book in a few weeks from now. But it wasn't clear that from the beginning that Esther would be included in Tanakh, or that Purim would be made into a holiday. Ultimately, however, all the arguments had, Esther won the day, and her book and her holiday were established forever. And we still celebrate Esther, celebrate Purim, and read Esther till this very day. Now, notably, as a side point, about 100 years ago, they found the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, where they found many of the books in Tanakh, which had been written by a very old Jewish sect, written around the time of the early Talmudic period, and nowhere in any of those texts that they found did they find anything from the Book of Esther, which is interesting. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. They might have had the Book of Esther, because some books that they found recorded there are only attested to with a very, very small piece of parchment, including only a few psukim, which takes some work to figure out which book it came from. So some books have very, very small fragments. And as I mentioned, the Book of Esther is one of the smaller books in Tanakh. So it wouldn't be entirely surprising that it exists somewhere and they haven't found it. But nevertheless, they haven't yet found it. And furthermore, to complicate this issue, make it a little bit more interesting, the Qumran Jewish community used a calendar where the 14th of Adar would fall out on Shabbos every single year. And the very beginning of Maseches Megillot talks about how to observe Purim if it falls out on Shabbos. And you really can't observe Purim if it falls out on Shabbos. You have to push you have to do the observances of Purim on either an earlier time or a later time. You can't really observe Purim if it falls out on Shabbos properly. In our calendars, Purim will never fall out on Shabbos, but with their calendars, Purim always fell out on Shabbos. So if that could be connected to maybe the reason why they didn't have the Book of Esther is very speculative, but I leave that for your consideration. Now, it wasn't only Jews who had issues with the Book of Esther. The early church fathers were concerned with both Esther and Shir Shirim as well. Neither book is mentioned or quoted anywhere in the New Testament, and some Eastern churches still question the Book of Esther and are not so sure about it. And in the 16th century, Martin Luther, who began the Protestant Revolution, was a horrible anti-Semite, said that he wished the book had never been written. And one more point on this vein, in the Septuagint, the Greek version of Esther, which usually the Septuagint follows very closely to what we have in our versions of Tanakh, but not so with Esther. In the Greek version of Esther, there are an additional 100 verses, many of which include explicit references to God, to prayers, to Moshe, to Mordechai's prophecies, and similar things. So the Book of Esther, my point is a very interesting and strange book. And it's not quite similar to the rest of the books of Tanakh. It's a little bit more controversial. It's slightly more marginal, but something about it grabs us. It's a really fascinating story and an incredible motifs and themes, as I've written, as I've spoken about earlier. And it's a remarkable book. Now, in halacha, for the final part of this year, before I open for if anyone has any comments or questions, is that there's something exciting about the Book of Esther. And I don't mean that as a historical or a sociological or personal statement, but I mean that as a matter of a halachic principle. The first Mishnah on the end of the 4th chapter of Maseches Megillah says that if anyone heard the Book of Esther read by multiple people at the same time, then they have fulfilled their chiyuv, their yotzei, the chiyuv of hearing Esther on Purim. Now, that halacha would not be the same for hearing the Torah. When you hear the Torah reading, only one person is allowed to read the Torah at a time. If two people read it, or even if two people translate the Torah at the same time, they are not yotzei their chiyuv and they have to read it again. Now, Esther, the Gemara says, even 10 people can read it at the same time, and everyone listening is yotzei their chiyuv. And the question is, why is Esther different? What's the difference between Esther and the other books of the Torah, and even there are other books in the Nevi'im? And the Gemara gives the answer there, that kivan de chaviva yahavi datayu v'shamei. Since Esther is cherished, since Esther is special, since the people have a certain soul connection to the Book of Esther, and they really enjoy the story, the listeners will pay close attention and they will hear the book. Even if 10 people read Esther at the same time, everyone listening will have discharged their obligation. So not just as a matter of it being an interesting book and it being a book that has all the elements that I've mentioned earlier, or a book that maybe is a little bit more controversial and more interesting in that way, But even halacha recognizes that there's something different and special about the book of Esther beyond the other books in Tanakh. Rambam says, writes explicitly that Bimos HaMashiach, every book will be, the other books of Tanakh won't be read anymore or will be nullified, but the book of Esther will be read forever, even when Mashiach comes, because there's something that's a little bit different about Esther. And so this is the background that I wanted to give for the book of Esther. If anybody here has any comments or questions, I'd love to hear them.
I have Mark Siegel, just one question. Typically, especially in Torah, when we have midrash associated with any narrative, there is always or almost always a very good explanation from another verse or from another source or something that ties it in. It's not like it's coming out of thin air. There's usually some textual context that allows the midrash to have that commentary or that story or that added color to a narrative. Here, precisely because it's just so many of these are so added there, does it have the same element of connectivity, or are these midrashim really, as they say, out of left field?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Mark. Thank you for raising it. So the way it seems to me, and I am by no means an expert on either midrash or Esther midrash. They are very interesting though, and I love going through them. It seems to me that what's happening with the midrashim on Esther is that there are certain questions that come up among the Talmudic rabbis. So, for example, how is it possible that Esther was able to sleep with a non-Jewish king? And in asking that question, you have to make a few assumptions. First of all, the assumption is that Esther and Mordechai, through whom the Jews were saved, were holy people and they knew what they were doing. And the moment you make that assumption, you need to answer the question of how is it possible that what they did was something which seems like an apparent sin. And once you have to make that assumption and you go down this path, you have to construct a narrative to explain the background and to explain how it was possible that they did what seems at surface level to be something that was against the Torah tradition. And really, when you go down this rabbit hole and trying to explain how these things worked, it seems that at a certain level, ein l'davar sof, that it really keeps going on and on and on. And there are tons of midrashim. Now, the midrashim of Esther come from a few sources. One comes from the Gemara Megillah, and a few scattered midrashim elsewhere throughout the Talmud. There are midrashim like Medrash Rabbah, and specifically Esther Rabbah, which talks at great length about many of these stories, some of which I've quoted above. And also, there are two Targumim, two Aramaic translations of Esther, which really are not translations. They are massive expansions on the story. And every single pasuk could have pages and pages of Aramaic commentary or filling in background of explaining the stories of what's going on behind these characters. And every single one of these characters has massive background that's filled in. Achashverosh is, according to some midrashim, began his life as a stable boy, and he worked his way up, and that's why he was such an erratic king who got drunk all the time. According to others, he had more royal pedigree. But I think that the midrashim, and the reason why they're so wild in Esther, is precisely because it's such a controversial book. You needed to have really good explanations and a lot of background to explain the kinds of problems that I tried to go through in this year. So to me, all the midrashim come from a lot of these questions, and that's really why they are so interesting, and really they seem like they're coming from out of left field. But if you track the narrative and you kind of trace them through, they really start to build a fuller picture and make more sense. Additionally, there might be a second reason. This will be much shorter answer. The book of Esther, and this is explicitly in the Gemara in several places, was one of the books where the rabbis would expound it in midrashic fashion in order to wake up their students if their students were falling asleep. So every so often you might have a rabbi who would say something deliberately outlandish about the book of Esther because he knew it would wake up his students and would get them to start paying more attention in the shir. So some of the midrashim, it's possible, are based on these stories and are not meant to be taken literally. They were meant to be pedagogic devices. And some are really world building and narrative building, which to me is one reason why I love the book so much and why there's such depth beyond what the story itself says. But that's a long answer to a very, very good question. I hope I've shed some light on it. And let me know. And if anyone else has any comments or questions, I'm here to hear them.
That's great. Thank you.
For sure. I see one comment. I think it's just someone saying hello, which is, I will say hello. Thank you for coming. Okay, so if no one else has any more questions, I really appreciate everyone coming. We'll be continuing next time from the beginning of Esther and going more in depth with some of these narratives and trying to understand this very interesting book, and hopefully to understand it in a new light and to shed new information on this, because one of the most popular, but also maybe one of the least understood books in Tanakh. And again, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom. Take care. Thank you.